If we're right, this is an asymmetric upside. Rarely do you get a chance to change a market, and that first mover advantage is going to be significant. We will be right for a decade if we're right.
Sometimes the biggest decisions just don't happen at the right time. They happen before you've built a track record, before you're known, before you're trusted. And you don't have any data because you're the first. And yet every now and then a leader has to decide anyway to act. Not because they're comfortable with what might happen if they're wrong, but because they're so confident about what could happen if they're right. I'm Jimmy Allen, and this is Founders Mentality, the CEO Sessions. Kevin Lobo is chair and CEO of Stryker, one of the leading medical technology companies. He's born in Mumbai, raised in Montreal, and he's from a family where getting a college degree wasn't the norm. He spent his career moving through industries he didn't grow up in, asking questions other people weren't asking, and taking decisions other people weren't ready for. Kevin joined Stryker in 2011 and became CEO within a year. And almost immediately, he did something that surprised his board, upset some of his customers, went against the advice of industry experts, and sent the stock down 4% in a day. He was right, but it wasn't clear right away, which makes for a pretty uncomfortable ride.
People felt that robotics wasn't needed in orthopedic surgery. Surgeons would be trained on a certain implant, and they would use that implant for their entire career. Prior to being CEO, I saw that Mako had made progress with robotic assistance for partial knee as well as hip replacement. Then I became CEO, and I decided that this is the deal I wanted to pursue. It was highly risky because it was a publicly traded company, about $100 million of revenue, loss-making. Partial knee is only 4% of the knee procedures. It was a small portion of the market, but they were making great progress. And I felt that the total knee application, which was going to come in the years ahead, was going to be the killer application. The cost for this acquisition was $1.6 billion, which seemed gigantic at the time, given it was a $100 million company losing money. But I really felt it was going to be a game changer. But I would tell you it was extremely unpopular.
Kevin, take us back to you recommending that decision. I imagine you, fairly new CEO, walking into your board with customers opposed, with your advisory council opposed. Bring us into that room.
So when we walked into the board, the pitch, to boil it down simply, we have a chance to transform the orthopedic industry and to differentiate our company from all the other orthopedic companies. Historically, market share never moved in orthopedics. Whatever they were trained with is what they ended up retiring with. We will be able to move massive market share. We will improve the satisfaction of total knee replacement through the use of robotic-assisted surgery. We will be less invasive to the patient. We will be more precise, more accurate, more consistent, and Stryker will become the number one company in hips and knees.
What was that like for you? And now that you've probably looked back, what the hell was that like for your board?
The board ultimately supported the deal, but it was difficult. They pushed back, and frankly, it was understandable that they would push back. The first area of pushback was, why should we do this deal now? It's a publicly traded company. They're not for sale, and you're a brand new CEO. Why do you want to take such a big risk at this time? And there was two major reasons why I wanted to move at that time. This total knee application was going to happen. A year before we did the deal, the stock was at $44. It had dropped all the way down to $16. And I felt that once they announced they had a total knee application, the stock was going to jump. The second reason was one of our major competitors was going through a very tricky, difficult integration of a different acquisition. And I knew that they would have interest in this technology, and they had deep pockets, so they could afford to spend $1.6 billion. If we moved quickly, we would be able to take the asset out. And then, of course, the second question was, well, what happens if you're wrong? You believe this is going to be a value-creating deal. What happens if we're wrong? And so what I said at the time was that if we're wrong, it's not going to kill the company. We have such a strong balance sheet. We could afford to make a $1.6 billion bet. At the time, we were a roughly $7 billion sales company. We're now $25 billion. But back then, it was a sizable deal for our company. We had not done very many acquisitions, certainly not of that size. But I felt that wouldn't kill the company. And if we were wrong, it would be a niche like navigated surgery. And we'd write off about $1 billion of goodwill. And so I said that, and a couple of directors reacted a little bit anxiously with, we've never had a write-off of any size, let alone $1 billion write-off. But I said, that's if we're wrong. If we're right, this is an asymmetric upside. We will be right for a decade if we're right. And that first mover advantage is going to be significant. So I leaned in hard, and I felt that it was the right decision for the company. On a personal level, I knew that I was betting my job on this. Many CEOs have gotten fired because they've missed on acquisitions, but usually they're larger transformational deals. In this case, I really wasn't betting the company when I was pitching this. Some of the board members were totally with me. Some of the board members were totally shocked and surprised, and some were doubtful. But eventually they backed me. They could feel my conviction. They knew I was willing to bet my job on this, that it really was a risk worth taking.
Most leadership stories end right there. The pitch, the room, the moment the board was convinced by the CEO to go from no to yes. But Kevin would tell you that was the easy part, because then he had to live with the decision to buy. Kevin was changing an industry. This acquisition was a smart one only if he changed the market, changed the behavior of surgeons, changed the way his customers bought and his sales force sold. But behavioral change takes time. And Kevin knew this. He could measure the market moving and the behaviors changing by how many robots he sold. So he told analysts and he told the board to focus on that single metric. Kevin, you answered one of my questions, which is while the company could survive, you were fairly certain that you might not survive if you were wrong. During those 2 years, was there any point during that 2013 to 16 that you thought, oh my goodness, maybe this was the wrong bet?
No, I really didn't know until we launched the total knee application. And as we developed and had surgeons involved, some of them started to feel, okay, this does make sense. So I think I got enough positive signs over the 3 years. Believe me, they weren't all sunny days. The first quarter after we did the deal, we only sold one robot. I told Wall Street, because I told them I'd communicate how many robots. So I said, we've had challenges with integration and we only sold one robot in the quarter. It was a bit embarrassing, to say the least. Even at the time we did the deal, they said, when are we going to know if it's a good deal, the investors? I said, you have to wait till we launch a total knee and give us 18 months after, and you'll see market share move in a very significant way, hundreds of basis points of market share, to which they said, that's never been done in orthopedics before. And I said, well, actually, Mako with partial knee did move market share very significantly over 4 years. And they're not even an orthopedic company. And so I had conviction throughout. Well, there were some rocky days during that couple of years. I just was patient, and investors actually surprisingly stayed with us.
Often the way these things are described after the fact is, you made a tough decision, you were right, and then went on. But what people don't talk a lot about is the time lag. You made a tough decision, and then that decision looked pretty tough for 2 years. During that time, were you still able to make other tough decisions while kind of waiting for that first big one to be right?
First of all, just related to Mako, we had to win over our own employees. That was very difficult. And honestly, we didn't really understand robotics. We thought we did. We didn't really. We understood orthopedics. It was very humbling for the team. They had very difficult 2 years. Their bonuses were not good in their first couple of years. And we realized that if we don't get our sales forces behind, this is going to be a problem. But the other thing we did is we started doing other tuck-in acquisitions. We're now known as a serial acquirer of companies, which had not been the case before. But this was the first deal. The other deals became more normal, just standard small product tuck-ins that fit inside our existing business. And those started creating value. And that started to earn credibility with investors, is that we were doing smart deals. They weren't all swinging for the fences. There were some write-ups that, this new CEO is crazy or he's making these wild decisions. And so I think during the intervening period before the total knee, we did a series of other smaller deals that made a lot more logical sense to people and delivered value very quickly. And through that process, I reached outside for help on acquisitions to get advice. And one of the people I reached out to was Larry Culp, who I had never met, but who was legendary leader of Danaher and had been a great serial acquirer. And so I cold called him And he actually took a lunch with me. He was excellent. He was very gracious with his time. And then I asked him to come and speak to my total global leadership team. And we talked about acquisitions as well as integrations. And what we learned is that we were not great at integrating. We didn't move swiftly enough to bring them into the Stryker way of working. And Larry provided a lot of advice. And I reached out to other people as well. And then we started to build our own playbook. So what I like to say now is that every time we do a deal, we do make mistakes, but they tend to be new mistakes, not the same mistakes we made from prior acquisitions. We now have an integration team that works on these deals, and we have a best practice playbook. But I think that during that intervening period, doing well with other deals bought grace with the board, with Wall Street, and we also started to raise our growth profile. So we were growing roughly 4% organically back in 2013. And in the last 3 years at Stryker, we've grown double digits. And acquisitions has been a big part of that, because if you buy a company that's growing faster than you are, after 1 year, it rolls into your organic growth. And all of our acquisitions, we've done over 60 in the last decade, are all growing faster than Stryker's growth rate. And so they've raised our growth profile. But we've done a much better job integrating and, frankly, learning, being humbled by some of the deals that didn't go as well.
One thing I've heard from CEOs is they often don't know what their company's way of working are until they need to begin to explain it to some of the M&A targets that they've done. How much has your integration been, we had an existing way of working and we teach the new group? How much has been, we actually learned what our way of working was through these acquisitions? And how much did your way of working change because of these acquisitions?
Our way of working was pretty well understood. We operate in a very decentralized operating model where each of our 22 business units has direct control over their sales, marketing, R&D. So when we do a tuck-in acquisition, it's really not being bought by Stryker. It's being bought by Stryker Endoscopy or Stryker Neurovascular. It's really being bought by that business, and it tends to be very intimate with the customer. At least for tuck-ins, that's been the case. Larger deals, which happened later in my tenure, like our Wright Medical, which was about $1 billion of revenue, when we did that acquisition, we actually took our shoulder business and moved it into their shoulder business. And we had their leaders leading foot and ankle and shoulder for the total company. So that was different, where we realized they had practices in many cases that were better than our own. And we started adopting some of their practices and made those Stryker-wide practices. In the early days, we knew the way we were operating. We tucked them into our business. The problem was with some of the adjacencies. If I think about Sage, which was a standalone business, we left it alone too long, didn't migrate it into our quality system quickly enough. And those are the kind of things we started to do faster, not leave those alone. But the tuck-ins were actually not as difficult, very good return on investment because we have great sales forces, and those are frankly pretty easy for us to implement. The integrations that were more tricky were the adjacencies or the larger deals.
Yeah. I'm looking up in my shelves right now, one of the very first books on strategy I read was about what is corporate strategy. And the question was always, are we the right parent? It's not, is the company good or bad that we're trying to acquire, but are we the right parent? And I'm tying the two things together. You said we are scalers, but I think part of that is because you asked the question, what if we're right? One of the things that I've seen so often in corporations is they don't actually play to the asymmetric risk. They'll take all the downside, but they'll leave so much of the upside on the table because they don't shift resources to the winners. They don't back them all the way. And it feels like that's one of the main lessons of Mako is it forced you to ask the question, what if we're right?
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing I didn't mention with Mako is it was dilutive to earnings for 2 years. And, shareholders don't love dilution to earnings. So it was a long-term bet. It was, and the write-ups, I still keep some of the clippings because they were pretty negative, to say the least. Again, most of the deals we do have really limited upside, limited downside. They're tuck-in deals. They're range-bound. They're not asymmetric. This is one of those asymmetric ones. And you do want to take swings every once in a while. The other thing I didn't mention was that our two competitors were coming out with their own new knees. And we did not have a new knee being designed at all. So I felt pressure to do something different to differentiate ourselves. One of the biggest risks wasn't just doing Mako, it was not doing a new knee because all the implants are really good. And by doing Mako, we didn't have to do a new knee, which would have been a $400 million investment. And we never did. Right now, our knee design is the oldest on the market, and we have the fastest growing knee, which had never happened in orthopedic history over 50 years. There was a series of risks building upon each other. It was a big, big bet.
So here's what Kevin built in those 2 years while he and the board were waiting. It wasn't just credibility. It was a machine, a repeatable model for buying companies. 60 plus acquisitions, 22 business units, double-digit growth, which would have been, in his words, unheard of the last 50 years in his industry. From the outside, that looks like a hell of a lot of complexity. But from the inside, Kevin would tell you it's the simplest, repeatable model in the world. We are scalers. We know what we're great at, and we only buy companies that we can grow faster than anyone else could. And that's it. That's the whole thesis. And here's what I love about Kevin's story. He remained humble. He remained curious. Mid-crisis, stock down, one robot sold. He calls Larry Culp, former CEO of Danaher, one of the great serial acquirers in history, someone he's never met. And he asked him to lunch and asked for advice. He changed the question from what if we're wrong to what if we're right. That's conviction. Conviction isn't arrogance. It's not a misplaced confidence that you know it all or can do it alone. It demands curiosity. It demands you ask for help so you can turn your journey into a playbook and then a repeatable model. And by the way, if you want a masterclass on repeatable models, go to episode 5 of season 1, where we talked to Sunny Verghese at Lobo. Kevin built a well-oiled machine, which actually then surfaced a very different question. What happens when the model starts working too well? And that's the inner game. And that's where we're going next. One of the themes that's come up in these CEO discussions is the distinguishing between the outer and inner game of strategy. And what I mean by that is, on one hand, CEOs talk about acquisitions. We change the rules of the game with Mako to do X and Y, unprecedented change in market share differences within knee replacement that had never happened before. We're taking share here. We have this growth rate. That's kind of outer game. Inner game is growth creates complexity, and that complexity kills our growth. And so how do we manage almost the unintended consequences of our success? If you take a moment and you take 22 business units, 60 tuck-on acquisitions, double-digit growth, all those dimensions scream complexity. How have you kept the culture, kept simple leadership principles, kept the magic of Stryker when all of this success, and I'm putting quotations around it, has the seeds of your own destruction with the complexity that might come? How have you played the inner game?
It's a bit of an art, to be honest with you. What we've decided is that certain functions and responsibilities of our business unit leaders and presidents are kind of sacred. So sales, marketing, R&D, business development, solid line finance, solid line HR. And those business leaders feel like they're running their own business. They can pay their people whatever they want. I had an HR person come from another company and say to me, do you realize we have 400 different sales compensation programs? I said, yeah, that's interesting. Why are you telling me this? Well, she said, shouldn't we have less? I said, no, they're creative. You're selling a bed is very different than selling a neurovascular coil that's put in someone's brain. They have the freedom, they have the authority, they can pay them whatever they want. If they want to pay more to their salespeople, they still have to hit their numbers. So they're going to have to cut money from somewhere else. And we've maintained that autonomy. But to your point, we have decided and evolved over the time to create some what I'll call shared services. So for example, robotics. So the joint replacement division developed Mako for hip and knee replacement. We have a different business, upper extremities for shoulder, that wanted a shoulder application with Mako. It would make no sense to create a new R&D team within shoulders to do a robotic application. We have a shared service for that. We have a shared service for 3D printing. So We did have to evolve our org structure to create some of these shared services. Now, that's not easy in a company that likes to have control over everything as business leaders. So what had to change, we used to be fiercely decentralized and almost competitive between our business units. Now we are much more collaborative. We're also starting to move people more between divisions, which we didn't do before. So we have evolved as an organization, but the concept of you're running a business, you're an entrepreneur, you have freedom to make decisions, to pitch acquisitions, that type of thing, we've given them tremendous autonomy. And we fought against having these corporate functions sort of overrun them. It's challenging because corporate functions have good intentions, but they do have to sort of keep their hands out as it relates to the decisions around R&D, the decisions around investments, and let them make their decisions. And we live with the decisions that those leaders make. So we managed to maintain the right balance, but it's not easy. Your point's a very good one because complexity can be a silent killer. But there's also good complexity. I think the 400 different sales comp plans is good complexity, but there's a lot of bad complexity that can be created as well. And I wrestle with that a lot, which is how do you keep that special sauce, but also not do dumb things and induce complexity that you then choke on as an organization. It is constant struggle, honestly, very challenging, not to become bureaucratic, not to slow down. With good intentions, people will put practices in place that can then slow down the business units and I would say defang the leaders of the business.
With a CEO who is working so hard to actually create 22 entrepreneurial CEOs, my question was going to be then, Kevin, what's your job? And in many ways, I think you answered it, which is I'm the guy that is trying to create trust, collaboration, and avoid the false synergy of bureaucrats. Someone from the corporate center that says, I've got the solution that's better than all 22 of you. Is that your job?
The first part of the job is strategy, right? So where are we going to play? Where are we not going to play? So a big part of the job is deciding on new adjacencies that are not in those 22 business units, for sure. The mission, the values, common brand, which we've created. So what are the things that are not negotiable that everybody has to adopt? So there's all these other areas that those people aren't managing day to day that I spend a lot of my time overseeing and making sure that they work for our organization. And then I do spend time in reviews with these leaders, poking and prodding. The job is not really to give people answers, it's to ask them questions, to make sure they're thinking more fully. And, what about this deal? What about that company? So I'm constantly meeting startups and listening, and it's just creating the provocation and the push for growth and the push for ambition. I think part of my job is to try to shrink the company. Hey, I saw this division do this really well. Maybe that can be helpful to you, to be a connector across the organization. I'm obviously telling the story to investors, managing the board, the standard CEO responsibilities. But it is different in a decentralized company because honestly, I'm the coach. I'm not the player. I'm not on the field. That distance, some people would find challenging. I quite enjoy it, enabling these leaders to make their own decisions and to push their business forward. But having this mindset of growth orientation, playing for growth, betting on them, coaching them on leadership principles and things like that. That's really the job.
Can we just pause here? Kevin's speaking about a very classic corporate strategy question. What is the role of center? He creates entrepreneurs. So he runs a decentralized model, empowering his business units to compete. And then he says, and so we have a lean corporate center focusing on a few shared services. And when he said this, I kind of expected the next words to be, legal, IT, HR, because this is what most of us think when we hear the word shared services. But Kevin then said, robotics and 3D printing. Of course he did, because this was the thesis of the original deal. Use technology to transform markets, shift competitive advantage. The lesson of Kevin isn't this. Be brave and take tough decisions against all advice. The lesson is ask the question, what if we're right? Because if we're right, we've changed the basis of competition. And we've created a repeatable model of M&A and post-merger integration because we know something others don't. Because if we're right, we create 22 business unit presidents, each of whom feels like a founder of their own business. And they have a few shared technologies and a CEO who's mastered the science of poking and prodding. The outer game, redefine markets. The inner game, act like an insurgent, bring founder's mentality into every business unit, leverage scale advantages where you can while shrinking the company. The inner game and the outer game. And underneath it all, this is a story of conviction. It's knowing the solution is right for the customer. It's having the courage to wait until behaviors change. It's about asking for help to create a repeatable model that 22 founders can use to redefine their markets. You know, most organizations ask, what if we're wrong? Kevin asks a very different question. Everything from today's episode and every episode is at bain.com/founders-mentality. And we'll be back in 2 weeks. Stay curious. Next time on Founders Mentality, the CEO Sessions.
This is going to sound funny, Jacqueline, but we actually had a debate about acumen and specifically about you, that if you got to a crisis and you had to choose between the poor and your LPs, people thought you would choose the poor. And I said, are we really having this conversation?